Easter, a time for fake grass, plastic eggs, these things, chocolate bunnies, and people dressed as bunnies. And then there are the weird parts of Easter, like fake grass, plastic eggs, these things, chocolate bunnies, and people dressed as bunnies, which is interesting. But what does all this stuff have to do with Easter? And if this holiday is about more than candy and wearing uncomfortable clothes to church and lunch with your relatives, what makes Easter happy?
Hey everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. We've been missing you guys over the last few weeks. This is a brand new season for us, so we're going to begin something we've never done before. This is our first ever at-home series, and so we're going to start this week talking all about the upcoming holiday. So this is week 1 of our series, Happy Easter. As some of you may know, we believe that Easter isn't just a happy time where we're celebrating because of chocolate and Easter eggs and creepy 70s rabbit mascots. Easter is worth celebrating because of the life of a man named Jesus who lived 2,000 years ago. You see, Jesus was the Son of God who came to live as a human for 30 years. And on what we call Good Friday, he was beaten and left to die on a cross. But what Easter represents is 3 days later on Sunday morning when Jesus did what nobody had ever done before, when Jesus came back to life from dying on the cross. You see, when Jesus does this, it changes everything. And it especially changed the life of a man named Paul. You see, Paul was a religious leader a long, long time ago who hated Christianity. He made it his life's mission to kill anybody, I mean it, to kill people who had followed Jesus. But Paul has this interaction with Jesus after he saw Jesus raised from the dead and come back to life that changed Paul's life forever. So much so that Paul went from being somebody who was an enemy of the church to becoming somebody who was a hero of the church. You see, Paul's an unlikely character to do this, but Paul became one of the main authors of all of the New Testament in the Bible after he has this interaction with Jesus. And because Paul changed so dramatically, because Paul went from being against Jesus to for Jesus, he had a lot of enemies in his life. And nobody understood what it meant to live in fear or to be surrounded by fear better than Paul. I mean, Paul was persecuted for what he believed in. Paul was beaten, he was shipwrecked, he was left on islands, he was locked in prison, and even at one point bitten by a venomous snake. I mean, talk about gross, a venomous snake. But Paul never allowed fear, he never allowed the constant danger that he was in to control the decisions that he made or the life that he was living. Paul understood that fear could cause happiness to leave quicker than anything else. And as a result of what he had encountered with Jesus, fear never controlled him again. And we see this really evident in a letter that he writes to the church in Corinth, in the book of the Bible called 1 Corinthians, when Paul taunts one of the biggest fears that all of us have, the fear of death. You see, in 1 Corinthians, this is what Paul says. He says, "Death has been swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? Death, where is your sting?" I mean, Paul does something here that takes like a lot of courage to do. Paul's literally looking at death, one of the scariest things imaginable, and he's like, "Come on, bro. Do you think that you can beat me? Do you think that you can hurt me?" Paul is like literally taunting death. And this is something that I don't have the courage to do, that I don't know if you do either. This is something that not a lot of people have the courage to do because death is a very, very scary thing. For most people, their biggest fear is the fear of dying. Because what dying and what death represents is a finality to our lives and to the things around us. See, death feels very final. And maybe we're talking about actual physical death, but maybe it's also the death of relationships or the death of a dream that you had, the death of your sports season, the death of the rest of your school year. You see, all of a sudden, death causes the things that we were so sure of to become extinct, to not exist anymore. Death is final. But what Paul does in this verse is he tells us that we actually don't have to be controlled or to be fearful of death. We get to live a life that is bigger and more courageous than what death has to offer us. Paul says that death no longer has to be something that controls you, something that you should be fearful of. Because he says in the beginning of that verse, death has been swallowed up in victory. What Paul's referencing there is the fact that when Jesus died and then rose again from the dead, Jesus did something that nobody had ever done before. He defeated death. Jesus absolutely defies every law, every principle, every thought that anybody had ever had about death being final when he arises Sunday morning and comes back to life. And Paul says that you no longer have to fear death. You no longer have to fear the finality of death because of what Jesus has done for us. See, because the reason that fear can be so controlling is because fear tries to convince you that it's final. When fear tells you that it's final, that's when fear has control over your life. When the fear of what others think of you becomes final. When the fear of what this pandemic might mean in your life becomes final. When the fear of what that social media post is going to make you look like. When the fear of not getting a date to prom or to homecoming becomes final in your life. It represents the fact that it is controlling your life. But what Paul states in this verse is so powerful because he says the most final thing anybody can think of, the finality of death, no longer has control because Jesus defeated death when he rose from the dead. Paul reminds us of this in Romans when he says, the same spirit that raised Jesus from the dead is the same spirit that lives in you. What Paul is reminding us of is the fact that when we decide to follow Jesus, when we consider all that God has done for us and we give our lives to following after what he's called us to, the same spirit, the same power that defeated death and raised Jesus from the dead is the same power that you get to have. The same life, the new life that Jesus found is the same new life that you get to find. And what Paul reminds us of is the fact that that new life comes without fear. I'm not saying that fear doesn't have its place. I'm not saying that things aren't scary. I'm not saying that you'll never feel afraid again, because I think we can all be honest that this season is really scary. It's really scary thinking about what's going to happen in the next few weeks and few months. It's really scary thinking about losing the rest of our school year. It's really scary thinking about the health of our parents, the health of the people around us. It's really scary thinking, what about the health of myself? What Paul is saying is you don't ever have to not feel a fear again, but you can live a life where fear doesn't control you. You can live a life where fear is no longer final. And that's the difference that Easter makes in our lives today. It's the difference that Easter made in Paul's life. And it's the difference that I think will help steer you from being controlled by fear in a season where lots of people have been completely controlled by fear, into living a life that's controlled by peace and happiness and contentment. Because what Easter Sunday represents is that fear is no longer final. That's the one thing that I hope you take away from this video. If you forget all of the awkward 70s rabbits and the fact that I like Reese's eggs, if you forget everything else that I've said, I hope you can walk away remembering the fact that Easter means fear is no longer final. Paul makes that very clear when he talks about the fact that death no longer has control of us. When he talks about the fact that fear no longer has control over our lives. I'm telling you, students, you can live a life that is no longer controlled by fear. Fear can no longer have a grip over your life, over your relationships, over your decisions, over your peace, over your happiness. What would it look like in your life if fear no longer controlled you? Because that's the power that Easter Sunday has to offer you. That's what Paul is telling you to walk into, to step into. And so I just want to challenge you with one thing. Where in your life is fear holding you back? Where in your life right now, not like when you go back to school, not like a few months ago, not like what you think could be the case, like what in your life right now is being controlled and held back by fear? Maybe for you right now, it's the fear that you don't even really want to come out of your bed because the anxiety and depression that's been controlling your life has caused you to not want to move. Maybe it's the fear that a relationship is about to end. Maybe it's the fear of everything going on around us. But I know that the feeling of fear is something that we try to get away from and something that we no longer want to experience. And I'm telling you, students, if you were to lean into what Paul is telling us, if you're to lean into what Easter Sunday represents, if you're to lean into the life that Jesus has to offer to you, fear would no longer control who you are. So remember this week that Easter Sunday means fear is not final. And we hope to see you back here next week and week 2 of Happy Easter.
Hey guys, thanks so much for joining us this week. Don't forget to check out our social media pages for our latest updates. High Point students, stay tuned because we're going to have virtual life groups coming soon.